This is a very evocative and intense script. My goal is to rephrase it by primarily adjusting word order and sentence structure while preserving the dark, haunting, and intimate storytelling style of the original. Paraphrased video script. Better than any man, they said, the mountains could keep secrets. And in these mountains, some secrets were so heavy with shame, so twisted, that beyond the ridge, even the wind dared not carry them. The beginning of this one was a cabin without an address. A cabin that had stood longer than the people who built it were even remembered. Inside those rough pine walls, the entire life of a girl had been shaped by one man, a man she was told to call P from the moment she could speak. But one day, husband is what she would stand before a preacher and call him. Into choice, she was not born. Far from prying eyes and far from law in these deep hollers, children were raised according to bloodlines, not morals. And running in tight, closed circles that never welcomed outsiders, bloodlines here ran. The man who raised her wasn't only her guardian. He was her blood. The stories say that on the day her mother died, he claimed her as his own. Though the truth of who her mother was is a puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit. She was his daughter, some whispered. His niece, others said. But in places like this, those distinctions hardly mattered. Blood was simply blood. Laughter or the innocence of play did not mark the girl's childhood. It was marked by silence, the kind that follows you like a shadow and clings to walls. She knew to keep her head down, to avoid the creak of a floorboard that might draw his gaze. Trouble, she learned early, had a way of being brought on by questions. Yet, the unthinkable came all the same. When she was 15, he began to tell her she was a woman. Now he spoke of keeping the family name pure, of legacy. Though pure is not the word anyone outside these hills would have used. A duty, he told her, was why God had placed her in his care. And in the twisted world he built around her, that reason led to just one thing. He would marry her himself. In softer cloth, there is no way to dress such a truth. It happened, and it happened because resistance did not exist in her world, without resistance. A wedding in any sense you would recognize, the event was not. No music drifting on the air, no flowers, no guests were present. On a cold, gray afternoon, in a church that had seen more vows than funerals, it took place. The preacher was an old man whose sermons were stitched together from memory, and whose eyesight had long since dimmed. He asked no questions, not about her age, not about their blood, not about the strange heavy quiet that seemed to hang over the two of them like fog. If you wanted to live in peace in these mountains, you didn't ask questions. She wore no gown, only the best dress she owned, one that had belonged to her mother, cinched at the waist with a piece of twine and hanging loose at the shoulders. He stood beside her, his hand gripping her arm just above the elbow, firm enough to keep her from stepping back, or perhaps just to keep her steady. Short were the vows, spoken low, and swallowed up by the thick wooden walls of the church. Not by love, but by law, or at least by the thin, brittle paper that passed for law out here, the moment was sealed. The few who heard of it did not speak of it openly. That day, a woman at the general store swore she'd seen them, his steps slow and deliberate, hers small and quick to keep pace, walking down the muddy road. The preacher's wife, another claimed, she'd overheard mutter that she hoped the girl would survive it. But quickly those whispers died. Out here, minding your own business and your own blood was what survival depended on. From that day forward, she was no longer the girl he raised. In the eyes of the insular world they inhabited, in duty, and in title, she was his wife. Her life was bound to his every demand. She tended his garden. She cooked for him. In his bed, she lay. And if she walked into town at all, when she walked into town, she was introduced as Mrs., followed by his name. It looked like any poor mountain marriage to those who didn't care. To those who did, it was entirely something else. And the strangest thing, no one even tried. No one came to save her. Before sunrise, with the sky still a heavy black curtain over the ridges, her days began. She would start the long, slow work of keeping the house warm and him fed, stoking the fire in the iron stove, the same one that had blackened the walls of that cabin for decades. Only a shared air thick with unspoken truths existed between them, no warmth. A low rumble edged with threat was his voice when he used it, for he was not a man prone to kindness. But the silence was what crushed her most often. A silence that seemed to say he owned her breath, not just her body. To work without needing to be told twice, to move quietly, to keep her eyes down when he was near, she learned. The sudden bursts of temper that could come without warning were a way to avoid every small act of obedience. She could not recall a time he had smiled at her, yet like a child starving for crumbs, she found herself searching for any sign of approval. There was no escape. They were a cage, not a wall she could climb over, the mountains that surrounded them. Where would she go, even if she ran? She had no kin outside these hills who would take her in, no money, and no sense of the world beyond. Her thoughts never strayed beyond the hollow they called home, for he had raised her in such a way. Of that, he had made sure. Their distance was kept by neighbors, if scattered as they were, you could call them that. At the well, a passing traveler might notice her, a thin figure in a faded dress, her face pale under the sun. But few were willing to risk angering a man like him in a place where survival was already hard enough. And so in plain sight, she disappeared, unseen but alive. The sound of his boots on the porch at dusk, the hiss of boiling water, and the creak of the cabin floorboards, her world was reduced to these. This was not marriage. This was not love. It was a sentence. And without trial or appeal, every day she served it. The cabin felt smaller than it ever had the first time she became pregnant. The nights longer, the air seemed heavier. He took the news as if it were inevitable. No surprise, no joy, just a nod that said the cycle was turning as it should. 17, she was. The thought of carrying a child felt less like a blessing and more like a weight pressing down on her chest, her shoulders narrow, her body still slight. They knew whose child she carried, and they knew better than to involve themselves in such things. The midwives and older wives scattered through the hills who might have helped her did not come. Her midwife was isolation. Her nurse was silence. She labored in the same bed where she had learned what it meant to be his, the same bed she had slept in since childhood. Small, too small, was the baby when it came. Like the mule of a half-starved kitten, its cry was thin, and it did not last long. While the winter wind rattled the shutters, she held it for hours, rocking it against her chest. Watching, but saying nothing, he stood in the doorway. Still, its breath gone, the child was by morning. He wrapped it in an old blanket, carried it out into the cold, and buried it somewhere she never found. She never asked where. A year later, the second pregnancy came, and in much the same way, it ended. Then a third. She no longer allowed herself to hope for a child that would live as the pattern repeated. Each small grave, wherever he put them, was another unspoken scar on her soul and on the land. A word she knew, inbreeding was not, but that something was wrong, she knew. Too fragile their limbs were, their faces pale, the babies came too early. As if the mountains would not allow such a union to bear fruit, she began to feel as though the earth itself was rejecting them. But he never spoke of it. They were simply what happened, not tragedies, to him. And to her, they became part of the rhythm of life. A rhythm so unnatural, so warped, that how deep the damage ran, she could not see. Until time itself felt like a trick of the mind, years bled into one another. Her age, she stopped counting. The heavy heat of summer pressing through the cabin walls, the smell of damp earth in spring, the brittle crackle of leaves underfoot in autumn, and the relentless winters that drove them deeper into their shared confinement, the seasons were her only calendar. But something the years had done to him, too. The color of ash, his hair, once a dark tangle, turned. His body slowed, thickened, and the rasp of a man whose lungs had known too much cold air and smoke carried in his voice. Still, his hold on her never loosened. If anything, the weight of it seemed heavier with age. Freedom, she had long stopped imagining. It was just a vague, distant word that didn't belong to her, no longer a dream. Whispers that reached her in fragments when she went to trade for flour or lie. There were rumors, of course. When she walked in, she would catch two women at the store pausing mid-sentence, their eyes darting to her stomach, her face, her hands. Others wondered aloud if she had ever even been given the chance to choose her life. Some whispered about the babies that never lived. But into help, the whispers never turned. Pity was a currency no one could afford in these mountains. She sometimes wondered if the outside world was feared by him as much as he kept her from it. That they would laugh at her misery, treat her like filth, and call her names. People in the towns were cruel, he told her once. She began to believe it in time. Even if it was a prison, she began to believe that maybe the cabin was safer. That is the quiet genius of control. It convinces the prisoner they should lock the door themselves. If you're still watching, most people are already braver than you. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Would you have stayed and called it life, or would you have run? Because she stayed for years more. What finally began to crack the shell of their life together was sickness. A deep rattling cough that clung to him for months and left him too weak to chop wood, too weak to hunt. He grew ill one winter. She nursed him because she knew no other way to live. Keeping the fire high so the chill wouldn't finish what the sickness had started and spooning him broth. The balance between them shifted for the first time in years. More than she needed him, he needed her. She began to think in dangerous ways in those long weeks. Not with the door locked from the inside, but with the door open to the world beyond. She imagined what it might feel like to be alone in the cabin. She wondered if perhaps without him, she might survive. And once those thoughts took root, they refused to leave. But hope is not stronger than habit. Just as she always had, she stayed. While he lay coughing in their bed, she carried water, split kindling, and kept the stove fed. When he began to recover, she found herself strangely disappointed. The idea of freedom had brushed against her skin, and now it was gone again. It was not until the spring thaw that something finally broke. He went into town alone, his first trip in months, and she stayed behind. A day, then hours passed, and still he didn't return. If he had simply decided not to come back, or if he had taken up with someone else, or if he had fallen ill again, she didn't know. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel fear at his absence. She felt something else. Silence. Not the oppressive silence that had haunted her for years, but a lighter, breathing silence that seemed to whisper possibility. She could hear the wind moving through the trees, the creak behind the cabin, the sound of her own heart beating in her chest. The mountains felt like open country for a fleeting moment, no longer like a prison. But so simple, freedom in her world never was. He came back. The sound of his boots returned to the porch 2 days later, just as the thought of life without him had begun to take shape in her mind. The old weight fell over the cabin again, and the door opened. Whatever fragile idea of escape had begun to grow, whatever hope she had been nursing, it withered the moment she saw his shape in the doorway. He carried no apology, no explanation, just the unspoken message that she still belonged to him. Years later, after he was gone for good, carried out of that cabin in a pine box by 2 men from the church, she was left standing in the same doorway, staring into the trees. She had outlived him, but she had not escaped him. Into her bones, the years had settled. Turning back time, she could no more imagine than she could imagine leaving the mountains. She had been carved down to fit the life he gave her, molded into her place. But the absence of the walls he had built inside her was freedom for her, and those walls remained. The absence of a man, some said she was free now. She lived the rest of her days in that same cabin, fetching water from the same creek, sleeping in the same bed, cooking at the same stove, moving through its rooms like a ghost. Asking about the story they'd heard, the story of the girl who married the man who raised her, a stranger would occasionally pass through the hollow. She never answered. She would let the sound of the latch be her only reply and close the door. The truth was not something she cared to give away, not because she protected him, but because speaking it aloud would mean facing it in full daylight, and on the ground. She had learned long ago to keep her eyes fixed. Easily, the mountains never gave up their secrets, and some, like hers, were never meant to be freed at all.